In a world where ancient powers and fierce rivalries intertwine, JoJo's bizarre adventure Phantom Blood ignites a saga that redefines heroism. Long before we encounter stands or the modern style of Hirohiko Araki's later works, we had Phantom Blood, the foundation of an epic series. While some may consider it the weakest part of the story, I see it as a timeless classic that's fantastically paced and one of the best parts of the entire series. This story features two of the most iconic characters in all of Shonen. Phantom Blood also laid out the groundwork for one of the most popular and enduring franchises in Shonen Jump history. Whether you're new to this series or just need a refresher, this video I'm going to be doing a retelling of the beginning parts of the original manga. And hopefully I might be able to change your perspective. If you are one of those people who skipped or just dislikes this part, hopefully I can get you to give Phantom Blood another look. You may find yourself appreciating it in ways you didn't expect. Before we get into the actual story, let's take a moment and explore a little bit how JoJo actually came to be. In 1986, a 27-year-old Hirohiko Araki, already an experienced manga artist, was approached by his editor Ryosuke Kawashima. Kawashima pointed out that Araki's art style bore too much resemblance to that of fellow manga artist Hisashi Iguchi. He urged Araki to avoid creating derivative art, pushing him to forge a more distinct artistic identity. This pivotal moment sent Araki on a journey to redefine his style and make something truly unique. Determined to break away from past influences, Araki sought inspiration from a diverse array of sources. Classical films like Bram Stoker's Dracula and manga such as Fist of the North Star shaped his early vision. He also drew heavily from the world of classical art, particularly the sculptures of Italy, while also finding influence in the muscular physiques of action stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. As Araki honed his new artistic direction, he chose to start with a foundation of realism before introducing more modern and surreal elements. His distinctive use of bold, unconventional color palettes became a hallmark of his style. Rather than adhering to a rigid color scheme, Araki opted to let the emotional tone of each moment dictate his choices, allowing for a more fluid and expressive approach. With his new art style in place, Araki turned his attention to creating a manga that would explore the supernatural in a fresh way. He envisioned a world where the children and women could stand toe-to-toe with muscular men, defying traditional gender and age stereotypes. Drawing narrative inspiration from stories like the Saga of an American Family, Araki incorporated themes of family rivalry and complex intertwined destinies. He was also captivated by the idea of shifting protagonists, a concept that would become a signature feature of his future work. On January 1st, 1987, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Phantom Blood debuted in Weekly Shonen Jump. It would go on to become one of the magazine's most successful series, spawning a 2007 anime, now mostly lost, and a 2012 anime adaptation that continues to this day. Araki's bold artistic and narrative choices helped JoJo's Bizarre Adventure evolve into a cultural phenomenon, forever altering the landscape of manga. We begin in 12th century BC at the heart of Mexico, where an ancient civilization known as the Sun People, or what we recognize as the Aztecs, conducting a ritual. A woman pinned down with a blade poised above her chest lies at the center of this ritual. Blood is life, declares a burly figure wearing a strange stone mask. He speaks of the mask having a demonic nature, explaining that the blood of the maiden will activate its dark powers. As he plunges the knife into her chest, the blood spills onto the mask, triggering its supernatural ability. The mask reacts, sending tendrils into the man's flesh. But he remains standing, claiming he has attained eternal life. With newfound power, he drains the life force of a subordinate, gaining even greater strength before crushing the man into the ground. This ancient stone mask gave the Sun People not only immortality, but the potential to dominate the world. Yet mysteriously, the Aztecs disappeared. The story then shifts to 1880s London. We find ourselves in a dilapidated room where a sickly old man, Dario Brando, calls for his son, Dio Brando. Dario is on the verge of death, but before he passes, he hands Dio a letter that he believes will secure their future and bring immense wealth. Dario recalls an event from 12 years earlier, in 1868, on a rainy night. After leaving a bar with his soon-to-be wife and mother of Dio, he came across a carriage that had plummeted off the cliff. Recognizing it belongs to someone wealthy, Dario immediately set to looting the wreckage, stealing a ring and wallet from a man lying seemingly dead. His wife, however, noticed a newborn among the wreckage, but Dario, driven by greed, casually told her to leave the child. George Joestar, the head of the Joestar family, regained consciousness, and mistaking Dario's intent and believed he had been saved. Grateful for what he thought was an act of kindness, George vowed to repay Dario for saving his life, unaware that Dario had already robbed him. Not wanting Dio to learn the truth, Dario omitted the details of the incident, instead instructing his son to take the letter to the Joestar family and use their wealth to secure a prosperous future. Soon after Dario's death, Dio reflects bitterly on his father's cruelty and the misery he caused, especially to Dio's mother. In his final act of contempt, Dio spits on his father's grave. The scene shifts again, introducing us to a young girl being bullied by some local thugs, who taunt her for being from a wealthy family, as they destroy her doll. A young boy steps in to defend her. Despite his noble effort, he's easily overpowered by the bullies. They beat him while voicing their disdain for the rich. As the boy goes to wipe the blood off his face, he pulls out a handkerchief, embroidered with the name Joestar. This only provokes the bullies further, and they give him one last beating. The young girl Irina watches in awe and asks why he defended her. The boy, Jonathan Joestar, replies that he didn't do it for her, rather he did it because a gentleman must always protect a lady in danger. Jonathan returns home to find a carriage arriving at the Joestar estate. Out steps Dio Brando in an iconic and foreboding entrance. The two exchange introductions, but their meeting is cut short when Jonathan's dog, Danny, bounds over to greet the new arrival. Without hesitation, Dio strikes the dog viciously with the knee to the face. Jonathan is shocked by the sudden act of violence. Unbeknownst to him, Dio has already devised a plan. He will take over the Joestar family and ruin Jonathan's life in the process. After their tense encounter outside, Dio is formally introduced to the Joestar manor. Jonathan's father, George Joestar, welcomes Dio into the family with open arms, promising to treat him the same as Jonathan. Despite the unsettling introduction, Jonathan tries to forgive Dio for what he did to Danny, though he can't help but wonder why Dio refuses to apologize. Spotting an opportunity to start fresh, Jonathan offers to help Dio with his bags. However, Dio coldly grabs Jonathan's hand, speaking to him as though he were beneath him. He pulls Jonathan in close, declaring that he'll always come out on top and won't allow anyone to stand above him. Jonathan insists that he just wants to be friends. Dio dismisses the sentiment entirely, and he warns Jonathan to keep Danny away from him, as he hates dogs. As time passes, George becomes increasingly impressed with Dio, admiring his intelligence and manners. In contrast, George begins to believe he hasn't been strict enough with Jonathan, and his expectations on his son grow harsher. During dinner one evening, Jonathan's clumsiness earns him a reprimand, and George sends him to his room without a meal. Isolated and feeling the weight of his father's disappointment, Jonathan wonders if this is how his life will always be. The story shifts to a local boxing ring where Jonathan prepares for a match against Mart Watkins, the reigning champion. Jonathan stands in his corner, ready for the challenge. However, just before the fight begins, a new challenger steps into the ring. It's Dio. Jonathan's taken aback, but steels himself, knowing that he has to win. Dio, having fought in the rough streets of London, possesses an advantage with his experience in dirty tactics. With the crowd cheering for Jonathan, the fight begins. Dio, using techniques no one in the audience has ever seen, skillfully dodges Jonathan's blows. In a flash, Dio lands a sucker punch, catching Jonathan off guard. He follows up with a brutal underhanded move, jabbing his thumb into Jonathan's eye. The match ends with Dio standing victorious as he mockingly embarrasses Jonathan. After the fight, the crowd gathers around Dio, eager to learn his techniques. He smugly tells them he'll share his secrets, but warns them not to tell Jonathan, mocking him further by suggesting he can't keep a secret. Dio's plan is falling into place. He's methodically turning Jonathan's life into a nightmare, with the ultimate goal of becoming the Joestar heir and destroying Jonathan completely. Meanwhile, we find Jonathan sitting up in a tree smoking a pipe and trying to escape the turmoil of his life. He spots some boys and he knows walking by and invites them up to join him. They dismiss him coldly, implying they can't trust him, assuming he would snitch on them. Angered, Jonathan jumps down from the tree and confronts them, but they easily overpower him. Humiliated, he shouts in a frustration, demanding, "Who's a snitch?" His fury boils over, not just from the boys' taunts, but from his growing resentment he feels towards Dio from destroying his once happy life. Despite the misery Dio has brought, Jonathan finds solace in Danny, his loyal dog who remains his one constant companion. From behind a tree, though, Irina Pendleton appears, catching Jonathan off guard. As he rushes towards her, she shyly slips away, but not without leaving a small token of kindness, some grapes in his handkerchief, freshly washed. The same handkerchief from the day they first met. Jonathan, touched by her gesture, spots her in the distance and thanks her, inviting her to meet her again the next day. They quickly form a bond, spending as much time together as possible. Jonathan begins to feel happiness once more, with Irina bringing it back to life. They share many days together, and in a moment of affection, Jonathan carves their initials into a tree, making Irina blush at the sight. However, unbeknownst to them, Dio is watching from the shadows. Later, after Jonathan and Irina part ways, we find Dio following Irina as she walks home. He approaches her with a cruel smirk, venomously remarking that she's the reason Jonathan has found happiness, a happiness that Dio cannot tolerate. Determined to destroy the source of joy in Jonathan's life, Dio grabs Irina and forcefully kisses her. He smugly declares that he is the one who took her first kiss. However, his victory is short-lived as he watches Irina, disgusted, wiping away his kiss with water from a nearby puddle. Furious with her defiance, Dio strikes her across the face with a brutal backhand. We then cut to a gloomy London scene, where Irina is running away from Jonathan, clearly upset. Jonathan is left confused until a group of boys hurl a rock at his head. They taunt him, hinting that they know why Irina is distressed. Jonathan furious, already knowing that Dio has something to do with this. Jonathan's fury reaching its peak, he storms home, bursting through the doors and yelling out Dio's name. Dio rises from his chair, unfazed, fully aware of what he's done. Jonathan rushes at him, fist clenched, but Dio mockingly dodges his attacks with ease. Though Jonathan knows he stands little chance, he refuses to back down. All the pain and humiliation Dio has caused, fueling his rage, he cannot lose this fight. Before things can escalate any further, George Joestar storms in furious. He chastises Jonathan, accusing him of attacking a defenseless Dio. With frustration boiling over, Jonathan stops off, while Dio, despite his appearance of defeat, has a glint in his eye, clearly plotting something sinister. Later, we cut to one of the Joestar servants, going about his daily chores, casually taking out the trash. As he throws the garbage into the incinerator, he prepares to leave, but a disturbing sound catches his attention. Rustling from the flames, panic-stricken, he rushes back to open the hatch, only to witness a horrific sight. Danny bursts out engulfed in flames, bound and helpless. Someone deliberately done this. Meanwhile, Jonathan, emotionally drained from his encounter with Dio, spots Irina, but he's so distraught over what Dio has done to her, he can't bring himself to face her. Overwhelmed, he runs off, feeling lost and defeated. To make matters worse, upon returning home he is met with the devastating news of Danny's death, although Jonathan knows in his heart that it was Dio's doing. Yet the only question he asks is whether Dio has arrived home yet. Dio, reflecting on the fight, casually remarks that killing Danny made him feel better afterwards, yet admits that he must work harder to control himself. The cruelty that lurks within Dio's soul seems boundless, and Jonathan's nightmare is far from over. We then cut to 7 years later. Has anything really changed? The years have passed, but what has truly transpired between Jonathan and Dio? Surprisingly, the two seem to be getting along as we find them in the middle of a rugby match, with fans cheering wildly in the stands. Who would have imagined that after all that happened, that they could be working together as a team? They win the game with a flawless teamwork, and even Dio compliments Jonathan on their cooperation. As they exchange a few more pleasantries, they speak excitedly about rushing home to share the good news with their father. However, beneath Jonathan's smile, doubt lingers. He can't fully trust Dio, not after the events that took place all those years ago. Despite the outward harmony, Jonathan still struggles to even call Dio a friend, unable to erase the memory of Dio's past cruelty. While Jonathan contemplates this, Dio remains calculated as ever. Now on the brink of graduation, he is nearing the age where he can claim the Joestar fortune. His grand plan, carefully laid out over the years, is closer to fruition than ever before. The brothers arrive home, where we're introduced to an older and sickly George Joestar. His persistent, harsh cough troubles Jonathan, but George dismisses any concern attributing to his stubborn cold. Dio, ever manipulative, advises George against going to the hospital, warning that the doctors are only interested in making a profit. George, trusting Dio, agrees, revealing that he has already refused further treatment. Jonathan, filled with unease, watches the exchange silently, worried about his father's deteriorating health. As George praises Dio for his hard work and reassures him that he will always be treated as a true member of the Joestar family, Dio's confidence in his scheme only grows stronger. His plan seems within reach. Later, we find Jonathan in a dimly lit study, where his attention is drawn to the mysterious stone mask. Over the years, Jonathan has developed a keen interest in archaeology, something that Dio often mocked. But now it seems that his studies might lead to a vital discovery. Jonathan noticed the mask activates when it comes into contact with blood, and his curiosity about its origins deepens. As he searches through his books, a chest accidentally falls to the ground, and with it, an old letter slips out. The name on the letter, Dario Brando. Intrigued, Jonathan reads the letter, and the contents leave him shocked. Cut to Dio, calmly helping a servant bring medicine to George's room, but we see him pull out a second, more suspicious packet of medicine. At that moment, Jonathan storms in, confronts Dio, and presents the letter. He reads it aloud, pointing out how George's illness mirrors that of Dio's father. Dio, though outwardly composed, seethes internally, realizing that Jonathan is precisely close to uncovering his entire scheme. He asks to see the letter, but Jonathan, seeing through his ploy, refuses and pressures further. He asks if Dio always handles George's medication. Dio, unfazed, admits he does, insisting that George's symptoms mirror those of his own father means nothing. But Jonathan isn't buying it. His instincts tell him that Dio is lying, and he declares his intentions to have the medicine inspected. As Jonathan reaches for the medicine, Dio suddenly grabs his wrist, halting him. With cold calculation, Dio warns Jonathan. His actions display distrust in their friendship. Why would he want to destroy that bond? For a brief moment, Jonathan hesitates, questioning himself. Could he be wrong? Sensing Jonathan's doubt, Dio urges him to put down the medicine, telling him there's no reason to be suspicious. But Jonathan snaps back into focus. In a flash, he pulls his arm free. His resolve steeled, he puts Dio on the spot, demanding that he swears in his dead father's life that he is innocent. If Dio can do that, Jonathan promises to set that medicine down and never bring up the matter again. Dio, unable to control his rage, explodes, shouting that his father was never more than a piece of filth. He had no honor or worth. His anger rising, Dio demands Jonathan to return the medicine and punches him in the face. Despite the pain, Jonathan now has his confirmation. Dio is guilty. As Dio moves in for another attack, aiming for Jonathan's eye, Jonathan stops him, his strength now far surpassing what it once was. Even Dio is taken aback by Jonathan's newfound power. Jonathan swears on the spot that he will protect his father and the Joestar family from Dio's treachery. In a surge of strength, Jonathan lifts Dio and hurls him from the top floor. Dio, furious and desperate, realizes that his plans are unraveling before his eyes. Jonathan stands firm, declaring that Dio will never go near George again, and that he will have the medicine inspected and expose Dio's plot to the authorities. Dio knows with his goal so close that he must eliminate Jonathan before his scheme falls apart entirely. With Jonathan now fully convinced that Dio is the reason behind his father's worsening condition, he storms into George Josar's room. Without revealing the full truth, Jonathan tells his father that he must leave for London for 3 days and insists that during his absence, George should only take medication from the nurses. Trusting his son's judgment, George agrees, though with some concern. With his reassurance, Jonathan sets off for London, determined to save his father. Meanwhile, Dio is up to no good, rifling through Jonathan's desk. After some effort, he manages to pry it open and finds the stone mask. As he sifts through Jonathan's notes, it becomes clear that Dio had known all along that the mask could activate by blood. Yet he is uninterested in its historical significance. His sole focus is on using it to kill Jonathan without leaving any trace. We then transition to a frigid and cold London, where Jonathan arrives by carriage. The driver abruptly halts, warning Jonathan that he can go no further, as the streets ahead are far too dangerous. The place is known as Ogress Street, a haven for criminals and the cursed. Ignoring the warnings for the sake of his father, Jonathan ventures into this treacherous part of London. Navigating the twisted maze-like alleys of Ogress Street, Jonathan presses forward with determination. He finds himself at a dead end and notices a disturbing scene, a cat darting off with a puppy in its mouth. Then suddenly, 3 men rush out of the shadows, each intent of causing Jonathan harm. As the dust settles, a mob of criminals emerge, ready to finish off Jonathan. But Speedwagon, now impressed by Jonathan's noble nature, orders them to stop. He declares that anyone who dares to harm this gentleman will answer to him. Speedwagon, reflecting on Jonathan's earlier restraint, asks why did he not use his full strength in their fight. Jonathan explains that he believes Speedwagon had a family, just as he did. He couldn't bear the thought of causing them grief. Moved by Jonathan's honor and realizing that he had spared his friends from serious injury, Speedwagon recognizes Jonathan as a true gentleman. In a gesture of respect and atonement, Speedwagon offers to take Jonathan to the person he seeks, determined to help him find the answer about the mysterious poison. We cut to Dio wandering the outskirts city near the Joestar mansion. Is lost in thought. His emotions are spiraling out of control, and in his mind, it's likely JoJo's fault. As he takes another swig from his bottle of liquor, he collides with a man in the street. The men, insulted by the encounter, begin to hurl crude remarks towards Dio, even mentioning his mother. Dio snaps in a fit of rage and he smashes his bottle into one of the men's face. The other draws a knife, prepared to retaliate. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity to test the stone mask before using it on Jonathan, Dio moves swiftly as the man lunges at him with a knife. Dio deflects his attack, forcing the blade back into the man, killing him. With the other man's blood now spilled, Dio places the mask on the face, eager to see what happens. As expected, the mask spikes, piercing the man's skull. Dio initially revels in his success, satisfied that the mask worked. But then something unexpected happened. The mask began to glow. Dio, on the verge of death, watches helplessly. He's prepared to face his end, his vision fading as the sun rises on what he believes is his final morning. But just as the sunlight breaks, the man begins to burn. His skin ignites and flames, reducing him to ash. Now saved by the sunrise, Dio is both horrified and exhilarated. He understands the true power of the mask, and with this newfound knowledge, he sets his sight on unleashing it, preparing for what will undoubtedly be the worst night of Jonathan's life. Dio returns to the Joestar Manor, entering the darkened foyer. Annoyed, he shouts for the butler, demanding to know why the lights are out. From the shadows, Jonathan calmly lights a candle and steps forward. Dio, suppressing his anger, greets him politely, acknowledging his return from London. Jonathan, unfazed, states that he's already obtained the antidote and has already given it to his father. Dio is visibly shaken. Jonathan, though deeply pained by the betrayal of someone he has lived with like a brother, declares that Dio will be arrested. Dio, to Jonathan's surprise, accepts this without protest, remarking that such a decision is exactly what Jonathan would do. Being the man he is, the unexpected response leaves Jonathan momentarily stunned. Dio, however, is merely buying time. Secretly furious that Jonathan has survived the dangerous Ogre Street, he continues his facade. He expresses deep regret, blaming his actions on the hardship of growing up in poverty, which led him to make terrible decisions. He tells Jonathan that his return to the manor, rather than fleeing, is proof of his remorse. Jonathan's on the verge of believing Dio's act, is interrupted by a voice in the shadows. "Mr. Joestar, be careful, don't trust him." The voice belongs to none other than Speedwagon. He introduces himself to Dio, explaining that he followed Jonathan home out of concern. Speedwagon, who grew up in the darkest corners of society, claims he can sense a man's character by the smell. And Dio, he says he reeks of evil. Speedwagon insists that they must call the police immediately. He even brought in a witness to testify about the dealings of the poison. As the tension rises, George Joestar emerges from the shadows, accompanied by the police. Having overheard the conversation, George admits he only wanted to repay the debt he owed to Dio's father. He thought he had raised Dio well, just as he had Jonathan. But now, he wants nothing more to do with it. With heavy sorrow, he turns to leave, exiting back to his room. Dio, realizing he is cornered, pretends to surrender. He holds out his arms, requesting that Jonathan be the one to place the cuffs on him. Speedwagon warns Jonathan to stay cautious, but Jonathan, ever trusting, approaches Dio. As Jonathan nears Dio, he begins to speak, reflecting on the limits of human ability. He confesses that no matter how much one plans, things will always go awry, as long as they are bound by human limitations. With a sudden, menacing shift, Dio pulls out the stone mask, uttering the chilling words, "俺は人間をやめるぞ, JoJo!" Dio has survived. The battle is far from over, and this is only the start. But this is the end of the video. Phantom Blood is an excellent story that has you engaged the entire way with its fast-paced writing, never really having a dull moment no matter the way you choose to view the story, either the manga or
anime.
Jonathan and Dio are two of the best characters in the entire series, hands down. While some say Jonathan is the worst and he's boring even, the creator himself even says that, I find it fresh nowadays how realistic he approaches some of his situations. He is also a gentleman. Dio, on the other hand, is loved by all, even the creator himself. He sticks him into any story he can. Dio is definitely the most fun part of the story, for sure. He contrasts with Jonathan pretty well. He's pretty much the exact opposite of him, being the super evil of the story. And yeah, if you get all the way down to the end of this one, you'll see some really horrible stuff that he does. I will say myself, I used to not really enjoy this part for the same reason as many people, not having stands, but I've gotten over it and given it another rewatch and read, and I really did find myself enjoying the story, especially just watching Jonathan and his journey to defeat Dio. I just hope maybe everyone can give it a chance or give it a rewatch, and you might start liking it a little bit more.